Hi, everyone. I'm Evan Dixon. I'm the Vice President of Communications for Crest Forum. Just want to welcome you all again this morning. A few housekeeping things. If you haven't already, feel free to download the National Clean Energy Week app. You can find a QR code to download it right at the front of your program and follow along there, along with on the program. But we have some announcements throughout the day and also can give you information on things going on and the Wi-Fi information as well, if you're looking for that. Our next panel, which I'm glad to introduce, is a discussion on permitting reform. So it's my pleasure to introduce Cheryl Lombard, who's going to moderate this panel, and she'll introduce everyone else. She's the Senior Program Director of Power, Infrastructure, and Minerals for ClearPath.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Cheryl Lombard. I'm the Senior Program Director with ClearPath. I lead our permitting reform work, which we're going to spend a nice 45 minutes. We want to make this an interactive discussion. So I want to go ahead and welcome all the panelists to come up. We have Malcolm with the Hydropower Association. We have Rob with the Interstate Natural Gas Association, and then Kyle with CEBA. So welcome, everyone. So who in here works in permitting? Okay, so we have some knowledgeable people. Again, we want to make this very interactive. We're going to maybe do things a little differently than the other panels. We might maybe, like, not at the very end, maybe closer to the end, do some questions and then do some closing remarks. It's been a popular week with permitting. I think even yesterday alone, we had the CHIPS Act pass, which is going to the president, or not the CHIPS Act, but extending it from NEPA, all those new projects. We had the wildfire prevention bill, which Westerman and Peters, that had some NEPA extensions from forest. We had something that ClearPath has been very supportive about, geothermal and categorical exclusions with that. Yep. And then we have former President Trump, and then more importantly, Vice President Kamala Harris speaking yesterday about how she wants to lead on permitting reform if she is president. So we're going to start with the first question, which is the name of this panel. How can we deploy clean energy without permitting? We'll start with you here. Go ahead.
Well, good morning, everybody. Pleased to be here. Malcolm Woolf, National Hydropower Association. And from my perspective, you can't effectively transition to a clean energy grid with the existing permitting structure we have. A little bit of background on the hydropower industry. We currently have about 80 gigawatts of existing traditional hydropower, either run-of-river or reservoir hydropower, with another 23 gigawatts of flexible pump storage. So together, it's over 100 gigawatts of dispatchable power, which is incredibly valuable as we transition to a grid increasingly powered by variable wind and solar. You need to firm up that power. Carbon-free hydropower is a great resource for doing that. But what most folks don't realize is that 40% of the existing hydropower fleet is up for relicensing in the next decade. Now, these are forever assets. They can continue operating if they get a license. But the licensing process takes, on average, 8 years, often over a decade, in several cases over a generation. Given all of that uncertainty, there's a lot of incentives just to put more wind and solar, which is great, but it won't let you stream Netflix at night. So we've got a couple unique permitting challenges just for the existing fleet, not even for the new fleet. Just to give kind of one example, there's a lack of process discipline and accountability. To get one of our marine energy members, I love this example, they wanted to test a new hydropower project in the East River off of New York City. It took them, looking at my notes here, 12 years to gather 21 permits from 14 different agencies for a 1 megawatt test facility that was only going to be in the water for 18 months. It makes absolutely no sense. And the company, by the way, went bankrupt afterwards because having survived that process, there was no flow. Or no way to commercialize future projects. So we've got to do something different just to continue the existing fleet, let alone make the transition. I'll stop there.
So Rob, Malcolm was just talking about that certainty that's necessary. Let's talk about your membership and the needs.
So good morning. I'd like to thank the Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions for holding this panel. I'm very glad to be here, joining you this morning. I'm Rob Mosher with the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America, otherwise known as INGAA. We represent the midstream portion of the energy value chain. We move natural gas from production to end usage. As far as the question being posed, or the focus of our discussion today, the short answer is no. We cannot have a clean energy future without permitting reform. And INGAA's membership play a vital role in this. Natural gas infrastructure has repeatedly reduced emissions while providing a reliable, affordable, flexible, and dispatchable source of energy for renewable resources. I'll give you a couple statistics. The Energy Information Administration from 2005 to 2019 indicated that the power sector reduced their emissions, their carbon dioxide emissions, by a third. Half of those reductions were due to natural gas. So that in itself is just a reaffirmation of why natural gas is a component of this ongoing transition. EIA also reports that natural gas consumption has increased on an annual basis 4% since 2018. However, over the last 2 years, this same body has indicated that natural gas infrastructure, the supply constraints continue to become exacerbated, where you have record lows of natural gas pipeline infrastructure being deployed over the last 2 years. So that goes to the challenges of permitting reform. You have these reviews that have been stalled because...
For those of you that aren't familiar with CEBA, we have roughly about 400 member companies. It's representing roughly about $15 trillion of market cap, about 1/5 of the Fortune 1000 members. And the main goal of CEBA membership is to facilitate non-carbon emitting electricity procurement with a lot of those corporations. So corporations either have renewable procurement goals or decarbonization goals, something along those effects. Now, CEBA is made up of buyers, like I mentioned, and we roughly have 3 or 4 different types of buyers. Big tech, you probably are very familiar with some of the household names like Microsoft and Apple and Facebook. But we also include retailers like Walmart and Target, 7-Eleven, and manufacturers like General Motors, Rivian. We have some steel and aluminum smelters, and we also have some microchip fabricators. So each of those buyers come with sort of a different set of priorities on what they want to accomplish with clean energy procurement. I would say that when they are in the market for electricity, they're looking at reliability, they're looking at price, and they're looking at non-carbon emitting electrons. So to answer the question that was put before us, I think we will continue to deploy clean energy, but just at a glacial pace. We really do need siting and permitting reform to help accelerate the market penetration of not only just wind and solar, but as you've probably seen with some of our member companies, they're playing around with different technologies, and they would love to see legacy nuclear units that were retired over the last 10 years brought back to market. They're also exploring new types of technologies. We count in our membership startup nuclear firms like Oklo and carbon capture and storage companies like Net Power. So we have a number of different technology developers that are looking to partner with the buyer community. And so our hope is that if we can get siting and permitting reform, and we can achieve, for example, pretty significant investment in new transmission, whether it's new wires or additional transmission capacity along existing wires, those will open up opportunities for developers to be able to build that reliable, lower cost, clean energy. We also would love to see additional activity around interconnection queue reform. And that's interconnection on the generator side, and what a lot of our buyers are finding out is there's a little bit of potential interconnection queue reform on the load side as well. So that's a conversation that we haven't talked about a lot today. So really appreciate the opportunity to join the panel today and kind of share our perspective. We do feel like we are in a pivotal moment in the United States with the low growth opportunities being driven by whether it's data centers and in particular artificial intelligence learning, whether it's a reshoring of domestic manufacturing and longer term trends around electrifications of buildings and transportation. These are all good things. This low growth opportunity is a good thing because it means economic development, means job creation. It's a trend that we're wanting to support, and hopefully our buyers can use their buying power to help pull some of these new non-carbon emitting technologies to market faster.
For myself, just answering the question on behalf of ClearPath, we're an all the above energy. We want to have permitting reform for a variety of reasons. We have to have that certainty for the investments. But, as Kyle just said, the energy demands just from current customers in our states is just really something that is needing to be addressed, whether it's from the energy generation, also the transmission side of things. And then you add the onshoring of manufacturing and so forth. So it is paramount that Congress does engage. It is something that Congress needs to do. We can have these administration to administration actions, but we really need that certainty that moves forward. And one thing that we're starting to work on, and if you guys want to add, is also working with some of the states, specifically ClearPath. We're working with Republican governors. They're the ones that are the face, whether it's Governor Kemp down there for a hurricane crisis, but they're the ones when the power goes out that they're on the hook. They're also the ones that are looking for the economic development. So if any of you want to also add on the state side on permitting, and just quickly.
Well, I'll go and jumpstart it. Prior to joining CEBA, one of the fun projects I got to work on was looking to site a solar cell and solar PV manufacturing facility somewhere in the United States. And it was interesting working with all the different states on potentially capturing that opportunity. I would say at the time, there were different criteria. Yes, electricity access and supply was one of the criteria that they looked at, but it also was looking at workforce attributes. It was also looking at water, transportation corridors, things like that. What I would say has changed today is, at least for a big segment of this new low growth, electricity is now the main issue. And it is really driving corporate decision making. And it has a timing element to it as well. So the more we can support siting and permitting reform, again, to help invest in the grid or upgrade the grid so that we can provide greater opportunity for economic development, the better. What we are seeing is that certain governors, and especially state economic development offices, are starting to realize that new transmission investment is going to be absolutely critical for landing those new projects. And if your system's constrained and your utilities are not working proactively to try to build out the grid or to bring on additional capacity to serve that new load, our customers can't wait. They are going to have to move on to the next state and have a conversation with your neighbor and your neighboring governor about opportunities to build that and make that investment there.
Let me add on to that. Earlier in my career, I worked for the National Governors Association and then with governor in Maryland. And one of the things that governors do when they get behind closed doors is they gripe to each other. And they realize that when gasoline prices go up, the president gets blamed. When electricity prices go up, the governor gets blamed. And they often don't have a whole lot of control over spot prices for natural gas or LNG imports or other things on electricity prices, but they're nevertheless blamed and blamed at the ballot box if electricity prices go up. And our federalist system in this country is amazing in all sorts of ways, but as it relates to permitting, particularly I'll speak for the hydropower sector, FERC ultimately has to issue the permit. But FERC isn't our problem. They're actually doing a pretty good job. But FERC isn't allowed to issue the permit until all the other federal agencies, all the other state agencies, all the local agencies have issued their permits. And for an existing hydropower facility that's been operating often for 40, 50 years, it takes longer to relicense a facility that's already built than it does a nuclear facility, because there's no accountability, there's no process discipline to get the state fish and wildlife agencies that have important missions but different missions to actually do their job under the timetable stipulated by the legislation. So it's supposed to take 6 years. It typically on average takes 8 years, but again, I think it's Hells Canyon hydropower facilities in Idaho, it's 20 years plus, and they're still waiting for their relicensing.
So I think that's a good segue. Malcolm mentioned the construct of federalism. That is particularly pertinent for our membership because of the state review process under the Clean Water Act, Section 401, and this is for specifically for permits for federal infrastructure, in our case, natural gas pipeline infrastructure, and whether or not they're discharges into navigable waters. In certain parts of the country, that has been delayed and even blocked to varying degrees. So we're seeing that at the state level in addition to the other challenges associated within the federal government and all of the different agency reviews. But one other point I'd like to make, and going back to something Kyle said about the economic development component, is that we're also hearing from our member companies about the difficulty of keeping their unionized workers under contract with these particular delays when it comes to the permitting of infrastructure. Our member companies work for the largest unions, LIUNA, the operating engineers, the pipe fitters, and they have also expressed great concern about the ability to continue with those particular projects, and that has an impact across the nation.
So shifting back to Congress, and Republican governors in general have been very supportive of permitting reform. But we actually have a bill that is in the Senate, the Manchin-Barrasso Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024. It passed out of committee, very bipartisan, great discussion, very thoughtful discussion. What do each of your groups find promising or tweaks that you would like to see with the legislation?
I'll jump in and go first.
Your issue was a big one at the hearing.
Yeah, it was, for those of you who were able to see the markup, it was interesting. It quite an accomplishment for Senators Manchin and Barrasso to get a bipartisan package through 15-4. This is something that's been elusive for at least the last 4 years. So the fact that they were able to pull it together is impressive. It was not as ambitious for any sector as I think all of us wanted originally, but they were very focused on staying within their jurisdiction and figuring out a way to get this signed. I think the budget deal that was recently enacted requires the lame duck so that they can have a budget. I think that creates a vehicle for the bill to actually move and adds even more momentum. But I was as surprised as anyone else for little hydropower to end up taking almost half of the conversation at the markup. And the reason for that, I think, is simple, that the hydropower title was almost empty. There was one kind of typical provision for extending construction start schedules that's usually just enacted by unanimous consent. There were no hydropower provisions in there, and that was noticed by a number of senators on both sides of the aisle. So I left that markup incredibly encouraged at the commitments that both Senators Manchin and Barrasso made to remedy that problem. There's a number of provisions that I think have broad bipartisan support for hydropower that could be included. Things like clarifying that when you're doing routine maintenance and routine operations and maintenance, that doesn't require a license amendment. There needs to be more process discipline and interagency coordination so that every agency doesn't do NEPA in sequence, but maybe you coordinate a schedule at the front end. If you are going to have dozens of agencies issue permits, there needs to be some resolution at the end of the process. If one state says you must do X and another state says you must not do X, what's the licensee to do? Those are not hypotheticals. Some states are interested in trout. Some states are interested in salmon. The requirements are different. The licensee has no conflict resolution. We think a lot of those common sense things can be added as it goes to the floor. And particularly, there's a whole other chamber we got to worry about. And when you get to the House, Kathy McMorris-Rodgers, chairman of the House Energy Committee, longtime hydropower champion for Washington State, those provisions need to be in there if this has any chance of getting enacted, I would think.
Rob.
So INGAA's membership believes that let me back up. We commend the leadership of Chairman Manchin and Ranking Member Barrasso. They have been longstanding advocates and really champions of permitting reform for energy infrastructure, whether it be linear, renewable, et cetera. And so we appreciate their effort. The fact that it's a bipartisan bill is certainly a strong signal that there is interest within both political caucuses. As I mentioned earlier about our permitting reforms that we would like to see advanced, Senators Manchin and Barrasso also strictly adhered to their jurisdiction with the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which is a bit limiting for the process improvements that we are seeking when it comes to NEPA and Clean Water Act. So it's our hope that this will serve really as an impetus and a potential vehicle to move post-election during the lame duck session, where other proposals that are introduced by Senator Capito and other members within the Senate caucus are potentially either attached that would make those changes to those environmental statutes. And then there's also some activity on the House side as well with Chairman Bruce Westerman on the Natural Resources Committee. So there could be a lot of opportunity. It could also be really setting the table, and I don't say this to be a criticism for next Congress, but the signal is clear in that there is interest from a bipartisan perspective about ways in which permitting reform can at least be elevated as a matter of importance. And so we're optimistic.
All right, so CEBA is a huge supporter of the Manchin-Barrasso bill, and I'll explain why. But before I jump into the reasons, I do want to acknowledge the opposition to the bill that's out there, and I understand where they're coming from. We understand in talking to colleagues in the NGO community, there are basically two camps of concerns. The first would be the emissions crowd, who is concerned that the net benefit of the bill would be a net negative when it came to greenhouse gas emissions. I think that question's been asked and answered by the third way analysis that shows even, in some of the worst case scenarios, there's still a net benefit to the bill. So we were pleased to see that analysis released, and we understand it's making its way through the NGO community. The other part of the NGO community are the folks that believe that no new dollars should be invested in fossil fuel infrastructure, and I just don't see a path to persuading them to support this bill. Now, CEBA supports the bill because of the very strong transmission provisions and the renewables and clean energy development provisions in the bill, especially on public lands. We think those are incredible wins, but our position is obviously colored by the politics. If you're gonna get this type of bill across the finish line, it has to be a compromise bill. And it has to include the fossil provisions married with the transmission and some of the clean energy development provisions, because that's the reality in the Capitol Hill these days. The margins of control in both chambers are incredibly tight right now. And so anything that you want to hope to see get across the finish line and enacted into law has to be a compromise. And we think this was a really solid compromise. And like I said, the transmission and the clean energy development provisions are particularly strong. Now, we have a upcoming November election. And I would say if either party wins the trifecta, meaning they control the House and the Senate and the White House, then this bill's probably not going anywhere. But our working theory is that it'll probably continue to be a divided Washington, and it will be a very close margin of control in either chamber going into 2025. So our attitude is let's take this bipartisan win, let's get it across the finish line, ideally, like Malcolm said, during the lame duck. We would love to see the transmission provisions as they were voted out of committee preserved as strongly as they can possibly be. We're open to the addition of things like McMorris-Rogers hydropower permitting reform bill. That's another area that CEBA members have supported. So our hope is that once we see the outcome of the November elections, it'll inform what's going to happen during this calendar lame duck. If we do get a trifecta, we do think it's reset, and we may not have siting and permitting reform in 2025 because all the oxygen in the room may be taken up by comprehensive tax reform discussions and the expiring provisions. So anyway, we'll see what happens after November. Fingers crossed that there is this window of opportunity and we can get this compromise bill across the finish line.
So ClearPath Action, we as well did support and do support the Manchin-Barrasso deal for a lot of the reasons that Kyle just explained in CEBA. We are a global climate change organization, and in terms of the climate impacts, it will have them. And we do believe it is a good negotiated deal. And more importantly, it moves the ball forward. Would we like to see more certainty and more specificity, specifically on the judicial reform side? Yes. But this is probably what's going to get across the finish line. I will say, and I know Heather, she testified a few weeks ago at the Westerman discussion hearing on that draft. We're hopeful that Mr. Western and Mr. Peters will continue those discussions. They've made commitments. I'm not sure they're going to do legislation this year, but I think that's where we can move for next year and on top of everything else. And I do agree with Kyle as well. Next year is going to be all about tax. But there was a great letter I think the Clean Energy Buyers Association sent out that a bunch of our groups, including CEBA and ClearPath Action, signed on to try to push forward in this lame duck. But the good part, like I said earlier when I started this off, everyone is seeing the needs in terms of permitting reform. It is the hurdle, whether it's for a clean energy transition or just energy security. Everyone is starting to see the need. And that IGA money, you kind of name it, it's coming to a cross that we need to figure out.
Along those lines, it's interesting, the conversation thus far and your comment about Vice President Harris yesterday. I support permitting reform, but there's no details yet. I think permitting reform is one of those broad umbrella terms that means something different to everybody. So, and just from our conversations here, I'm focused on the Federal Power Act because it impacts hydropower. There's obviously critically important reforms needed in the NEPA and the 401 process from the Clean Water Act. Kyle's, focused on the transmission provisions. They're all permitting reform, but they're separate pieces. And we need to deal with all of those pieces if we're going to have a transition to a more secure, reliable grid. So it's, I'm hoping that this is how it all comes together to get enough political support from different places to get something done.
I think building on that, it's interesting. It has different meanings, but so many people don't work in it. That's why I asked how many people work in it. They don't even know what we're talking about. And you don't have to answer, but do any of you want to give your elevator speech explaining what permitting is on the federal side? Why you need to do it?
So not necessarily an elevator speech or pitch, but what I will say is that what INGAA's membership and what we have tried to do on their behalf is really, this is an infrastructure problem. And if you continually go back to that, it makes it not only more relatable, but you can provide statistics as to the number of new deployments for energy infrastructure, in our case, natural gas pipelines. And that is a way in which I think it is easy to understand, because when you start getting into reviews and all of the different statutes and how agencies need to or potentially coordinate and which agency would be the lead, and then talking about ways in which litigants are allowed to participate. I mean, it gets very complicated, like a lot of other things in Washington, D.C., but I think that's really the focus, at least, of our member companies, to ensure that this resonates and that there are a lot of implications. There's material impacts not only to their operations, but for the broader economy and our collective goals about energy security, reliability, affordability, and yes, sustainability.
When I went to my daughter's Green Schools program at elementary school and asked them, where does your electricity come from? The kids gave the same answer I think a lot of Americans would. It comes from the light switch. You flip the switch, the lights go on. And that's maybe all they need to know. So I usually start my elevator pitch on reliability. We all want a 24/7 reliable grid. And in order to have that, we have to change. We know the grid is old. We know the grid needs to be modernized. We want to deploy cutting-edge technologies. The beauty is they can make it more reliable, more dispatchable, more two-way consumer interface, and cleaner, all at the same time, while making it cheaper. We can get there, but you need that upfront investment. And a process right now that takes a decade in the hydropower space is not something that's going to allow us to remain competitive and keep the lights on.
Well, I'll just say our new talking points is just making it clear to folks that we are in a new low-growth environment and that there are these economic development opportunities, the types of things I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. Just looking back, in the 1950s, we had annualized load growth around 9%, and we were able to meet the moment. We're projecting that the low growth opportunities driven by the technologies I mentioned earlier could result anywhere from 1% to 2% on an annualized growth rate. That is a huge number. The problem is we've forgotten how to operate the electricity grid and build it out in a low growth environment. We've been benefiting from all the energy efficiency standards that were implemented beginning in the 70s and made their way across the country, and a lot of the offshoring of manufacturing contributed to that flat low growth as well. Well, it's changed. We are really in a pivot point, and if we want to meet that economic development opportunity, if we want that opportunity to occur across the United States, and in the case of our members, we want to see that low growth served with a reliable, reasonable cost, and non-carbon emitting resource, you absolutely have to invest in transmission. Now, I think the good news is that the arguments around transmission have moved away from what I would call tribal politics. At least they're moving away from that these days. And I think people are starting to understand, policymakers are starting to understand that this is absolutely critical for U.S. competitiveness. And if we want to have those good things, if we want to see job creation in rural communities, if we want to see building electrification and electric vehicles in the long term, you're going to have to invest in the grid. Now that comes with price pressures as well. So equally important at the time you're looking at building out this grid is making sure you're doing it not only in a clean way, but in a cost-effective way. And where siting and permitting reform can really assist in that is, rather than having the fragmented planning approach that exists today, trying to do something smarter, trying to not replace like for like, but replace with new and more exciting and more efficient technology. And so a lot of what we're saying, and this is my extended elevator speech, is look, you need to be thinking about the future and what it is that we envision the grid will do. It'll be a tremendous tool to the corporate community to help us remain competitive, to help us deploy new technologies, and in the case of our membership, to help accelerate the commercialization of some of those new technologies that we see in our toolkit that will help us meet the moment with non-carbon emitting resources.
So the highlights I got out of that would be, it's the investment in infrastructure, so we have reliability, and affordable energy, and clean energy. And that's the core of how we explain permitting. So I think we're going to do things a little different. Maybe open it up for questions. I don't know how we're handling those. And then we'll do some closing remarks. So we'll go from there. You can say your name and...
Yeah. So Bo Berthlight with Maritime Partners. I may be the only maritime transportation representative in the room. I'm actually going to be in a panel later this afternoon. The U.S. maritime transportation system, and arguably the global system, is influenced by the International Maritime Organization, which is part of the UN. So the United States is required to play by the rules. We get a lot of influence from EU regulations that work their way over here. Obviously, you guys are not subject to international regulations. What, if anything, is Europe doing that you're not doing, that you think they're doing worse, or that you're doing better? Because ultimately, we need the energy that you create or you transmit to be able to produce whatever fuel we're going to be forced to use in the future. So we're just curious. Thank you.
I'll jump in on that. Europe and Asia are doing a much better job, from my perspective, in building the necessary infrastructure to be competitive. And their main reason, and this may not be popular in this room, but their main reason is the government's got a big role in these projects. I know in pump storage, Switzerland, Austria, They're building new major pump storage facilities to have the reliability to firm up wind and solar, and the government is a huge player in financing those projects. In the U.S., we've not built a new facility in over 20 years because it's really hard for the private sector to fund a $1 billion plus infrastructure project that's going to take a decade, even if it's going to last for 100 years. It doesn't fit the investment timeline of the U.S. model. Other countries have a much greater government role in making sure we've got that kind of infrastructure built.
I would just say that in looking at the individual nations within Europe, you're talking about a much smaller scale. Now, if you combine them into, say, a European Union construct or something very similar, it gets a little different. But what I will say is that, going back to one of my earlier points about LNG exports, this remains a market that is growing not only within Europe because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also looking, extending over to Asia as well. So not to turn your question upside down, but that's an area where we are succeeding and we're looking to grow our market advantage, competitiveness on that front because there is a growing need for our natural gas in the form of exports. So there remains great opportunity, not only following and monitoring what they're proposing in Europe collectively, but also in ways in which we could collaborate.
So I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I would say that a number of the European nations individually are ahead of us on siting and permitting reform. If you look at Germany and the steps they've taken to remove roadblocks to the deployment of clean energy as part of their decarbonization strategy, I mean, let me do it so you guys see it. It's flat like this, and then project approvals have just jumped. They're ahead of us. They're a great case study. European Union has an office dedicated, it's a new office, but dedicated to siting, permitting, streamlining. They call it cutting bureaucracy and red tape. They have one office that their sole job will be to go out and try and streamline so they can achieve the decarbonization goals that they want to achieve as quickly as possible. So for them, siting and permitting is not only an economic development opportunity because they see a threat with what the United States doing with all this domestic reshoring and development and deployment and commercialization of new technologies, but they look at it as an opportunity to accelerate the decarbonization. They're prioritizing pace of decarbonization much more so than the United States, and they figured out that if they want to accelerate, they need siting and permitting reform.
It's a good question. Any other questions?
Oh, they can't let us off the
I
hook.
know, that's like Heather.
So Kyle, you brought up the ENGOs and this idea of, when I did testify before the House Natural Resources Committee, one of my main points I think that Mr. Westerman and his team wanted me to talk about was emissions are going up if we're not bringing more clean energy online. And that piece right there in ENGO support, I think is really critical to really see and to get not just a bill passed, but a bill that's got these pieces you are talking about. Malcolm, your point about, we all are seeing permitting a different way, but it's going to take a lot to get these pieces in, right, in negotiation. And I'm just like, what's next? What do we do to really bring, the letter? I'm sitting here this all sounds great. What do we do? So just next steps. How do we turn up the heat? That's my question.
Well, I'll be happy to start. I would be the first to acknowledge that Manchin-Barrasso is not the end of the conversation. It really isn't. For some of the other reasons that folks brought up, NEPA reform was not within the Energy and Natural Resources jurisdiction, so that conversation is going to continue. Whether the House can accelerate that conversation and achieve some sort of bipartisan compromise in time for the lame duck, I don't know. But I can tell you now that at least the provisions, the reforms that were included in Manchin-Barrasso are vetted. They've made it through committee markup, had a strong bipartisan vote. It's ready to go. And I would just say, let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good. It's an old cliche. Let's take what we've been able to get as a win and continue the conversation. I could tell you all the different provisions that were related to NEPA reform around geothermal that were passed by voice vote in the House last night. That was terrific. I hope the Senate can take those up and we can get those across the finish line as well. So my comment to folks is that let's take the win. Let's continue the conversation. My opinion is biased by the fact that, the whole reason that I came to Washington, D.C., believe it or not, I was working for Berkshire at the time, was to work on greenhouse gas cap and trade. They were spending lots of money flying me back and forth to work in 2008 and 2009 on different decarbonization proposals that the U.S. Capitol was considering, that Congress was considering. And so they thought, well, Waxman Markey didn't make it across the finish line, but something's going to happen soon, so we'd love to have you work in the D.C. office. I came out to the D.C. office. We didn't talk about carbon policy in any significant way for another 10 years. So my concern is that if we don't take what progress we can take in the moment, the conversation may get away from us, and we may not have another opportunity. And I think that what's included in the bill really will make a difference, particularly in transmission and clean energy development, especially on Western public lands, that it's worth, taking the win on that one.
And if I can add, I spent 10 years working at the Nature Conservancy, one of those, I would say, conservation organizations versus an ENGO. They have been helpful, I know, with the discussions on legislation, the messages on climate, and those organizations, they are for climate change and what we have to do to address it, I should say. But it's been a tradition of protecting NEPA. And then you have all the other groups that are litigious. So it's very challenging for them, but that's why I think all of us need to keep engaging with them, not fighting with them, but engaging with them and how we discuss and how we're actually going to move this forward, because it's all a science-based discussion. We can debate our science, but I think we all agree we need to change permitting. So I want to give us each just a moment to give one little closing thought in terms of a takeaway that you want this audience that you maybe haven't mentioned. So Malcolm, we'll start with you.
I'll start just by doubling down on the engagement with the ENGOs. In the hydropower industry, we started a formal process about 5 years ago called the Uncommon Dialogue, where we kind of, in an organized way, reached out to American Rivers and some of the leading groups and talked through it and found a lot of misconceptions, a lot of places where the words we were saying were being heard a different way. And we actually have we came together with a joint package. It took years to get there, but a joint package, which I think you just got to put in the work and engage. Part of my key message and maybe my takeaway for this group is just the urgency for permitting reform. In the hydropower sector, we've had 65 facilities that are carbon-free, economic. They have surrendered their license. The dam doesn't go away. The dams, the reservoirs are still needed for flood control, water storage, everything else, but they're no longer producing power because the licensing process just takes too long. It's a small number now. It could be a huge wave. We don't want to go backwards, and I don't think this gets any easier next Congress. We've got a lot of champions like Manchin, like Kathy McMorris-Rodgers, Annie Custer. They're all retiring. Barrasso is going to be in a different role likely. So I think it doesn't get any easier next Congress, and we need to get this done now.
Thank you. So my key takeaway, I think, from our session today is, I would just say, me too, and going on this train of conversation. And advocacy is going to be key, not only amongst stakeholders and building those coalitions, but also amongst lawmakers and other individuals involved in kind of the public policy making process. We've talked an awful lot about different segments of the economy and how they're all impacted by these permitting challenges for infrastructure, just broadly, whether it be energy or some other sector. That will remain pertinent and really key to achieving success. Even in incremental progress is still progress. And there's a lot of ways in which we can do this going forward, but it also makes for better and more durable policy as well when you have those coalitions. And yes, there will be opponents, but engagement is really going to be key. And otherwise, we will not be able to really accomplish our goals on behalf of our memberships. And then and finally, if you look at just going back to, another previous train of our conversation here, is that for different reasons, certain stakeholders and lawmakers are engaging on permitting reform, whether it's to realize the potential of the IRA or the IIJA or the bipartisan infrastructure law, or because there is an impetus to just build more linear infrastructure. The goals are still the same. And that's why it's critical. Those linkages, no pun intended, are key to our ability to advocate on behalf of this issue.
I see we're out of time, so I'm just going to be very succinct and say we need folks to acknowledge the politics in D.C. right now with the narrow control of either chamber. And like I said, our thinking is regardless of the outcome of the election, we think it'll probably continue to be split control. Compromise is going to be the currency of the realm. You're going to have to compromise in order to get legislative success. It's going to be really, really difficult otherwise to try and get new law across the finish line. So for us, we think siting and permitting reform is absolutely critical for new transmission investment, whether it be new transmission lines or reconductoring or deployment of GETs or what have you. And we think that for our membership to continue its decarbonization journey, we really want to see reliable, reasonably priced electricity that is non-carbon emitting. And for us, in order to continue that and meet the moment with this new low growth environment we're in, we absolutely do need the reforms that were included in the Manchin-Barrasso bill. We think that'll be that will really help. Do we think it's the end of the conversation? No. There are other topics to discuss. Folks keep mentioning NEPA reform. Those conversations, I think, will continue, and we'll see if they're ripe during lame duck with a bipartisan compromise or not. But please don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Let's take the win, and let's continue the conversation and make incremental progress towards our decarbonization.
I want to thank you all. We'll be around after or during the break, and so have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We have a short break to allow a few more folks to come and sit down, but we'll start right back at 11 o'clock with our next panel. Thanks so much.